Well, welcome to the second of our fall 2021 Kessler Conversations. My name is Bo Adams, and I serve as director of Pitts Theology Library here at Emory University, the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. The Kessler Conversations provide an opportunity to engage with experts from around the world to learn about the debates and reforms in Europe in the 16th century, and most importantly, to consider how contemporary communities may learn from these conversations. This fall, Pitts Theology Library has been excited to develop a series on Luther and the other, asking how Martin Luther wrote about and interacted with those who differed from him ethnically and religiously, and what we can learn as we live in a globalizing society where interactions with those who may be deemed as other are more and more frequent. I'm excited to welcome as our guest today the Reverend Dr. David D. Grafton. Dr. Grafton is academic dean and professor of Islamic studies and Christian-Muslim relations at the newly renamed Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. Many of you may know it as Hartford Seminary. Professor Grafton is a world-renowned scholar in the study of Islam and in the promotion of Christian-Muslim dialogue. Prior to his serving at Hartford, Professor Grafton has held faculty and administrative positions at Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia and the Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo, Egypt, in addition to serving Lutheran congregations in New Jersey, London, and Cairo. His research and teaching focus on both the past and the present, combining interests and expertise in Islam and Christianity across many centuries, with an active participation in Muslim-Christian dialogue and relationships, in both the academy as well as within churches and in mosques. His research has been published in the most prestigious academic journals, as well as in many public and ecclesial forums, and he's the author of a number of important books on the history of Islam and interreligious dialogue, including his most recent edited volume, More Than a Cup of Coffee and Tea, A Generation of Lutheran-Muslim Relationships, published by Pickwick in 2021, which I highly recommend to you all. So I think you can see why he was an obvious choice to help us understand the complex relationship between Martin Luther and Islam in the 16th century, and what we as citizens of the 21st century might learn from this past as we seek to engage more productively with those whose beliefs and practices may differ from our own. So, Professor Grafton, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
You're welcome. I'm delighted to be here. This is great.
So I want to offer a quick note to our guests. You do have the ability to participate. So Professor Grafton and I will talk, but as you have questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A section on the right side of your screen. And as we have time, I will relay those to him. And of course, we'll send him all the questions at the end so that you all have a chance to be heard. So, Professor Grafton, if we can, I'd like to start with quoting something that you wrote in a 2018 article on Luther and Islam. You say, quote, "Throughout Martin Luther's life and public career as a pastor, scholar, and biblical theologian, the Turk was always lurking in the shadows." Can you help me understand what you mean by this? Who is the Turk, and how much does Luther really focus on Islam in his writing?
Yeah, so we know that Luther wrote a lot, and he was probably one of the most, he probably was the most published person of his day. Wrote a significant amount of material. And, so we have over 50, 60 volumes in the English edition of Luther's works and over 150 or so in the Weimar edition. But he only has 6 particular works that he wrote on or about Islam. So that's not very much given the scope of everything that he did. And yet, we'll talk about those 6 works in a minute, but given that throughout all of his writings, the various different kinds of writings, biblical letters, Luther, the table talks, the Turk, he references the Turk all the time. In fact, one scholar noted that in the Weimar edition, there's over 5,000 references to the Turk. He drops this reference all the time, the Turk. And so it figures quite prominently, actually. And if we take aside those six items that he wrote, the Turk figures very prominently. And I say it's in the background because he just drops these notices about the Turk, and they usually are negative, and references to the Turk being like the bogeyman, someone who hides in the shadows and will frighten you, and you better be careful, or the bogeyman will come to get you. So, on the one hand, we have all these references that Luther makes. They begin in 1518 when he, in his explanation to the 95 Theses, and he makes a reference to the Turk, the last sermon that he wrote or preached right before he died. So his whole life, he references the Turk. But the 6 items that he wrote about, some of them are quite short. So he writes 2 treatises on war against the Turk, and then appeal for prayer against the Turk. He preaches a sermon, an army sermon against the Turk. And then he pens 2 prefaces for things that had just been republished. And one was an edition of a diary by George of Hungary that he read, and that became his primary reference point for Islam. He prefaced, he wrote a preface for that, saying this was important to read. And then late in life, he wrote a preface for an edition of the Quran that was just being published by Bibliander in Switzerland. And finally, he wrote a very quick and brief German paraphrase of a Latin text that a Dominican by the name of, or he called Brother Richard, or Ricaldo de Montecroce wrote, which was a polemic. Mm-hmm. So he has these 6 items, but again, I think really, these aside, what's really important to know about his thinking about the Turk is all these references. And by the Turk, he means literally the Turks are the Ottoman Empire. And for him, Muslims were synonymous with the Turk, and the Ottoman Empire was synonymous with Islam. Those were just equative terms.
So thank you. Just a little bit of point of context that I think you were just alluding to. I think you note that we can't think of Islam in Luther's mind as an alternative religious view. Rather, it's mixed up into politics. So what do we need to understand about the historical context related to the Ottoman Empire to the east and the threat of invading armies? So what is this perceived threat on the Christian empire when Luther was writing?
Yeah, so that's really important. I mean, anybody who's reading Luther and wants to figure out what does Luther think about Islam and the particular theological views or religion of Islam, it's all in the context of 16th century, what I call, this big risk game. There's these empires that are all vying for control of Central and Eastern Europe. The Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Empire, and then there's the French Empire. There's the Vatican states, the Italian states, and then there's the Ottoman Empire. And for Luther, the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs, who were fighting one another, really take center stage when he's writing about Islam. It's through that lens of the threat of the Ottoman Empire. And at that point, the Ottoman Empire was at its height under Suleiman the Magnificent, when it was making its incursions into Central, Eastern, and Central Europe. So that's critical to know. But what's interesting, and this is something that really just occurred to me as of late. Maybe I'm slow, but I've been reading Luther all my life. I've been taught Luther and his biography and what he wrote about his theology. But when we look at the 16th century, I mean, the world was changing dramatically. There was the discovery of the Americas, and there was the opening of trade. There was so much going on, and yet he doesn't really comment on any of that, at least in any great extent, So while there were all kinds of exchanges going on between Europe and the rest of the world, including Muslims around the world, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but also the Middle East and in Asia, South Asia, he's focused really primarily on these geopolitical issues that are going on in Central and Eastern Europe. So we have to just keep that in mind, because that's, what's going on there is part of the story of world history at the time, not all of it. And so Luther is fairly myopic in his view of Islam, because it's really, he looks at it through the lens of, how it's impacting German Christians, the fear of German Christians in Wittenberg and central Germany.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And as my understanding, Suleiman was close, right? It was a real threat to the East, and Luther uses that. So I'm curious, you mentioned his kind of understanding of Islam. What are his sources? What does he actually know about the religion of Islam? You mentioned he had access to the Quran, but what is his familiarity with what we can understand about Islam in the 16th century?
Yeah, that's what's, I think, really important when we think about how not only Luther, but how all of us engage with what we think we understand about Islam or Islamic sources. And the primary thing is, it wasn't until late in his life that he actually read a copy of the Quran, and then it was a bad translation. So very early on, for most of his life, up until about 1528, he had no sources on Islam at all. And his references were primarily through, let's call it social media. What he was getting from images and woodcuts and art. And of course, there's the very famous painting by Albrecht Dürer, the Apocalypse. Yeah, there we go. The Apocalypse that was done in the 1480s, I think. And so Luther saw this. He was very well read, and he would have loved art, right, and music. So he would have seen this. And of course, in Albrecht Dürer's woodcut, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, two of them are Turks. So there's this automatically, at least for people of the time, they would have intuitively known, oh, there's a Turk, right? The bogeyman. And in many other woodcuts of his day, especially during periods of warfare, there were images of the Turk at war. And so this certainly impacted how he viewed Islam and how he viewed Muslims, primarily through this social media and the general tenor of the way people looked at Islam. So I think there's some natural implications for us, which we can get back to in a little bit. But it was, as you mentioned, Suleiman the Magnificent in 1529 coming with his army up the Danube to Vienna and besieging Vienna is what prompted him to begin responding and writing. And so late in 1528, he comes across this diary, this journal that was published by George of Hungary, who had been a soldier in the 1480s. He was Hungarian, and then he was captured and spent 20 years in captivity in the Ottoman Empire, and escaped eventually and came into Italy and then wrote this diary. And in fact, one of my PhD students is working on his PhD on this, and it's a fascinating memoir, if you will. And Luther read this, and it talks about Muslim habits, beliefs, practices. And Luther saw this as his primary, as a primary reference point to understanding Islam, and used it regularly. And because of that, he wrote a preface to it. So that was critically important for him in understanding about Muslim belief and practice.
Well, I was just going to ask, I assume it's safe to say that he would not have had any personal interactions with an actual practicing Muslim. All of his knowledge would have been filtered through Christian responses to Islam.
Yeah, none that I know of. If other people know of one, I'd be grateful to hear about this. But yeah, unlike, his relations with Jews, where we know he had conversation with rabbis, and here there's no indication that he had any direct encounter with a Muslim to speak with them. But we know at the time there were all kinds of encounters going on. There were Muslim diplomats and traders and travelers, certainly in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands, in France at the time. So there were Muslims around. It's just that Luther in maybe backwater Wittenberg didn't have a chance or didn't take the chance maybe to actually seek a Muslim out for that. So there was that primary reference, George of Hungary's tract, and then two other ones that he read at the time. One was written by Ricaldo de Montecroce, who was a Dominican missionary, Confutatio al Corani, which was a polemic against the Quran written by this Dominican. And then he also read Nicholas of Cusa, who wrote a work was called Sifting the Quran, where Nicholas of Cusa wasn't polemical. Actually, Nicholas was interested in reading the Quran, a translation of the Quran, actually, to kind of see what Christian themes were in there. Was there a commonality? And what I find fascinating here is that he had Ricaldo de Montecroce's polemic, and he had Nicholas of Cusa's kind of sifting of the Quran, one generous and one polemical, and yet he chose the polemical one to actually retranslate in German. And I often wonder, what if he had chosen Nicholas of Cusa instead? We might have a different conversation about what Luther thought, but he didn't. So that's a future project, I think, in the near future. But then toward the end of his life, 1542, he was finally given a copy of the Quran to read, a Latin translation of the Quran done by Robert of Ketton from 1142. So it was a old translation, or as some have argued, a paraphrase of the Quran into Latin. And according to many, there's a really good book out there by Thomas Berman on translating the Quran in medieval Europe. And he says, it was a paraphrase. It was a bad paraphrase. But nevertheless, Luther got a hold of this 400-year-old Latin translation, and he read it, and he was appalled by what he read. And that prompted him to go back to Ricaldo de Montecroce's work, polemical work about the Quran, and quickly paraphrase this into German so some of the Germans could read, all the terrible things in the Quran that he wanted them to know about. So that was it, basically. He had very little experience or exposure, certainly with living Muslims and their views and practice.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's so important to keep in mind, that what he knew of the religion was all filtered in particular ways. Little plug for the Kessler collection, that I believe it's 1543 Quran, where he writes the preface, can be found in the collection, so you can come visit it if you'd like. I want to return to Dürer and the image you showed before. I mean, what's interesting, of course, is that is an illustration of a biblical text, right? And so it's a theological statement about and fitting the Turk within a kind of theological worldview. And in your work, you've made this point, right, that the Turk is functioning theologically for Luther. So who are the Turks in Luther's kind of narrative of God's story with humanity, and how does Luther speak about engagement with Islam vis-a-vis kind of his understanding of God's kind of broader history?
Yeah, that's critically important. One needs to say first and foremost that Luther was never really interested in Islam, as you mentioned earlier, just as a religion, or what it may have taught or believed, or what Muslims thought. Islam always functioned for him theologically like other things of the day, and that is he had this apocalyptic bent where the Turk functions as both a work of God to chastise the Germans, to chastise Christendom, but also a work of the devil and a minion of the devil. He has this dialectic going on. Luther was always good at dialectics, right? So he often talks about the Pope and the Turk in similar terms, that the Pope was, and forgive the vitriolic language, but the Pope was the Antichrist in spirit for the spiritual world, and then the Turk, or even Muhammad, was the Antichrist in the mundane world, the political world. So and some of the Lutheran artists, Matthias Gehring, for example, has some woodcuts where he lays out Luther's views of the Turk and the Pope, wearing their crowns and as demons, right? So Islam functions for Luther as this apocalyptic warning about the end times, that the end times are coming. And I wanted to read something that because I grew up and we still sing this hymn. One of Luther's hymns, "Lord, keep us steadfast in Thy Word," one of the more popular Luther hymns. I mean, it was originally written, "Lord, keep us steadfast in Thy Word, and curb the Turks and Papists' sword, who Jesus Christ, Thine only Son, would would tumble from off Thy throne." Now, I mean, when I sing that, we certainly don't sing those words anymore. I mean, it's sanitized now to curb those who by deceit or sword, but the Turk or the Pope aren't in there anymore, thankfully. But we do get this from Luther, that the Turk functions as a theological motif, like others, that push Christians to back to Christ. That everything that's going on in the world, wars, the plague, economic disparity, and religious strife, and now the challenges to the soul in church, and then the challenges to the body, are all there ultimately for Luther to drive Christians back to Christ and to repent and believe in him. So the one thing that can be said about Luther always in these writings is, and some scholars disagree with this about his view, but I really do think that when we take Luther's writings here, and like I said, we put them throughout, we compare them with his whole life, and the references to the Turk, he really has this pastoral sense that he's responding to the overwhelming fear that the German Christians had about the Ottomans coming, and he wants to try to provide a sense of comfort that in the face of it all, that Christ is there to receive you. And there's another item I wanted to read that I was just going over, that I think is lovely. Of course, there is his reference in A Mighty Fortress, but in his commentary on Genesis, that was written early on, he writes this, which is, I think, a preface to his A Mighty Fortress. He says, "No matter how much the world and its prince rage in the Pope and the Turk, nevertheless they will not drive out of me confidence in God. Satan shall not make things so sour for me, much less the Turk. To be sure, they can take away this life or property, wife and children, likewise good health, but I will hope in God forever." So this is Luther writing in his commentary on Genesis, chapter 41, which precedes, I think, the A Mighty Fortress. But the resonance is there. And so here particularly, he's talking specifically about the Turk, and how even though the Turk is at the doorsteps of the gates of Vienna, for example, Christ is there to receive one. So I think that's critically important in his whole kind of theological perspective. He may be an apocalypticist, a medieval apocalypticist, but at the end, he's not interested in people going out there and engaging in bringing about the end. He's just he's concerned about Christians and their spiritual and their emotional well-being, and so he wants to provide them a sense of pastoral support.
Thank you. I mean, with all of this historical work as background, I want to do the really challenging work, which I know you're deeply committed to, is to say, what does that mean for us, right? So how do we move forward in time and say, let's look back at Luther and see what kind of example he has set? And I suspect from what you've been talking about, on its surface, there may be not a lot of good there, right? That there is a kind of othering of the Turk, of Islam. And so, for those of us who are interested in a kind of more substantive and helpful engagement with those who are maybe different or practice something different than us, how do we look to the past and look to a figure like Luther and these references or this kind of stereotyping of the Turk to be helpful within, Christian theological education or within our kind of navigating the world where increasingly we do interact with those who have different practices or beliefs than we do?
Yeah, I mean, so we were talking beforehand about how, for some, knowing Luther's views on the Turks and the Jews, and there's no use in using him anymore, right? I mean, he's not PC. He's certainly not PC. And I teach a class on Luther, the Jews, and the Turks, and simply so we can dig into some of these important things for today, because it's really, really critical for today. In the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you walk in and there's Luther's words right there about drive the Jews out. So it's important to recognize this underside, and the ELCA did that in the 90s when it decried Luther's writings on the Jews and their lies. Yet there hasn't been one yet on his references to Islam. We hope that will change soon, but yeah, it's important because certainly for Lutherans, we need to figure this out, navigate his theological genius and also his humanness. And of course, that's built right into his own theology of being saint and sinner at the same time. So I think we've got that going for us. But I'm firmly committed to these to positive Muslim Christian relationships. And so, what do I do with this? How do I navigate through this? I think there's two things that are positive from Luther, and then maybe three things that are negative that we can turn to positive. We can learn from him. And the first positive is that he clearly was against any notion of a crusade against Islam. The Crusades had been, at least the church had long tried to establish a holy war or a crusade against Muslims in the Holy Lands, and part of that was through the sale of indulgences. Indulgences were not only for personal piety reasons, but also if you couldn't go on crusade, then you could buy an indulgence and have some of your penalties in purgatory remitted, and that was accepted. The money was then used for warfare, not only for building St. Peter's, but for warfare on crusade. And Luther wanted no part of that. He said the church has no business fighting a war. That's up to the civic and civil religious or civil leaders. And so the Pope and the bishops have no part in that. So I think that can be instructive for us when we see, unfortunately, so many Christians using apocalyptic or Islamophobic views of the Bible to encourage kind of a clash between Islam and Christianity. Even though Luther was an apocalypticist himself, he didn't encourage it. Whereas you find some Christians who are encouraging it. And he wanted no part in that. So that's important. I think that's important. The second thing that's positive is that he wanted good information about the Turk and the Turk's religion, and he sought that out. He didn't believe a lot of what he heard about Islam because he thought it was so wild and incredible it couldn't be true. So that's why when he received that edition of both George of Hungary's memoir, and he read about this firsthand experience of Islam. He said, this is good. Now that I have this, people should read this. And when he read about it, he had, of course, negative things to say about Islam and its belief, because it didn't believe in Christ as the Savior. But he understood what Muslims were believing and doing, and he, in several places, talks about how pious they are. They pray. They take God's name seriously, and so he challenged Christians to look at that and be better Christians from that. That the Muslims were better than the Germans, who were drunkards, right? So that's something that we can take, is that looking for good, proper, correct information, and then challenging ourselves as Christians about what we believe, and then engaging in positive conversations, not polemical conversations. So those were the positive things. The negative things that I hope can turn around for our advantage. Of course, I mentioned before, the first was the popular media or social media. He was affected by these images that he saw all around him. And it's almost like, he's looking at these and then he's writing his hymns. He's writing his letters to friends. He talked about in one letter, he was sickened to hear about what the Turks were doing in Hungary. So he's getting all this information, second, third hand, who knows. So that's instructive for us, right? Because we get all kinds of images and media information, and who knows where that information is coming from. And I think we would be better off served verifying things and looking more clearly at these sources. The second thing is, as you mentioned, he never spoke with a Muslim. He never met a Muslim. So he is doing what others call a dialogue across the borders. Jean-Marie Gaduel, a Catholic theologian and a historian, talks about this, that he's doing it with a barrier in between him and Islam or Muslims. So he never has this direct encounter. Well, that we don't need that anymore. I mean, we have Muslim neighbors, co-workers, even in our families, to engage in direct conversation and communication. So we don't need to do it across the borders, whether that border is political, or ethnic, or linguistic, or even in our own towns. We don't need to do that. And then the last thing I think that would be helpful to recognize is the Quran that he read was, as I mentioned, this 1142 translation of the Quran, or paraphrase of the Quran from Arabic into Latin, that was done by Robert of Ketton in Spain. And then because he was so offended by it, then he went back to Ricaldo de Montecroce's work and then paraphrased that Latin text into German, so that he could warn, his fellow Germans about what Muslims were saying, or about what he said Muhammad was saying, because he assumed Muhammad wrote the Quran, of course. So what this tells us is that, he's reading this old paraphrase of a Latin translation and it was a bad one. Translations matter. The edition of a Quran that we read matters. How it's translated matters. Because I often find with many Christians that they will try to read the Quran, and they'll say, I can't read it. It doesn't make sense to me. It reads very differently than the Bible does. There's no question about it. So how one goes about accessing the Quran is important, and Muslims certainly can help us do that from their perspective. Why do they read it? How do they read it? That's a more appropriate way to access it than simply looking for our own favorite negative verses in the Quran and using those as the center of what all Muslims believe, which is quite often the case.
Thank you. I love this last negative examples that we try to flip to the positive. I want to focus on the second one you mentioned, which is this question of dialogue, right? On the one hand, you're absolutely right that we have more of an opportunity for dialogue because we live amongst people who are different than we. And yet sometimes it still takes that extra step that I think a lot of us are not often willing to do. So, and I know this is a question about your entire career and your work, but what does that dialogue look like? I mean, you end that essay I mentioned earlier, and you say this, and I'll quote this: many Lutheran denominations continue to hold conversations with those who have felt the sting of Luther's offense and Lutheran violence, such as the Vatican, the Anabaptists, and especially the Jews. Thankfully, all have been challenged to move beyond Luther's vitriolic responses. Unfortunately, there has been no such official Lutheran conversation with the Turk to date. So at a denominational level or at just a kind of individual level, what does a Christian conversation with Muslims look like? What are the parameters to a helpful dialogue?
Yeah. So I'm going to reference a study that was done by the Episcopal, I think, Virginia Theological Seminary back in 2013. And sorry about that. And in this study, they interviewed about 5,000 different Episcopal priests, and they asked them several questions about interfaith dialogue, about what are you doing in your communities. And what came out of this study was clear that priests who had no theology or no introduction to Islam or other religions in their training at seminary did anything or very little with other religious traditions because they didn't feel like they had any knowledge or background. They didn't feel comfortable in it. They didn't feel like they could confidently lead their parishes in these relationships. Well, that's true. I mean, we know that in other cases that in seminary education that pastors who don't get training or some kind of background in interfaith work lag behind those that do. And that's just kind of a natural thing. But too often we relegate this kind of dialogue to the assumption that we're talking about theological dialogue, that we're talking about, okay, we need to get in there and we need to start talking about the Trinity and revelation of the Bible versus the Quran. Well, those are interesting things, and I love doing those in my classrooms. It's fun, but for most people, that's not what we're talking about. We're really interested in, what is your average person? What makes your average person believe in what they believe in? What moves them? What gives them hope? What gives them a sense of faith in their life? And so that can be accessed very easily simply by being in one another's spaces to learn about why they worship or how they worship the way they do. What do they do? What does it look like? That's an easy thing to do, to visit a mosque or to have a Muslim community come and visit a church. The best thing, though, is actually just to get together around food, because that, those particular food traditions we have in our churches are very simple ways that we can express what our faith means to us, right? The hot dishes or the casseroles or the potlucks or even the deli service, all those things that congregations do, sharing those with Muslim communities. And then most importantly, just having the opportunity to go to an Islamic center or a mosque for Ramadan to experience an iftar, a breaking of the fast where they share food. And it's great food to begin with, but over meals and over foods, then you really learn what makes people tick. Why do they do this? Well, most lay people, say, well, I don't really know why I do this. I just do it. It's a part of my religious tradition. It's a part of who I am and my family's tradition. That's the same thing for Muslims, right? So beginning there at the human level of the way people practice their faith, and prayer, the way people pray, is a good way just to ask questions about, wow, that's really interesting that you actually put your forehead on the ground. Why do you do that? Well, there's a good reason. But some people would say, I watch my dad do it, or I watch my mom do it, those are the human encounters, the kind of the dialogue of life, if you will, that actually makes more of an impact than these theological dialogues about the Trinity or Revelation, although those are important.
Well, thank you. I think we can all learn a lot from that, and then the kind of low barrier to entry of just getting to know people and kind of how they live and what their practices are. We have a couple minutes left, and we've had some great questions come in, so I want to relay some of those to you. I'm going to start with a question asked by my Candler colleague here, and someone I think you know well, Deanna Womack, who's on the faculty here. Professor Womack. Oh, there we go.
There's her book.
That's her book.
Yeah.
She asks, I would be interested to hear whether you think Luther's views of gender or race shaped how he wrote and preached about Islam or the Turk.
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure how to answer the issue about race. I'm not sure he would have talked in those terms. That was a period certainly of, he talked about being German and what it meant to be German, more so than European or white, of course. So I'm not sure how. That's a very good question. I'm not sure how to answer that. Regarding gender issues, certainly gender roles, he talked a lot or wrote about, which was not uncommon throughout much of Christian history, about the Turk's view of marriage, specifically what he saw the institution of marriage or family, which for him back then was bigamous, and so he saw polygamy as an affront to the family, and breaking down of the family estate. Literally, he talks about the estate of the family. So those are really good questions, and I know a lot of my colleagues who are doing work on Luther in other world contexts like South America or Africa, and African Lutheran views would be much better conversation partners about that, because I think they would be able to get better at the issue of race and gender.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question that Rod Hunter has asked, and we mentioned earlier that he was not for crusades, right? But Rod asks, did he ever express the hope for conversion of Muslims, or did he consider them irredeemable? I know that's part of the Jewish question as well, but how did that work for the Turk?
So he very rarely mentions the possibility of conversion, but he does say that it is possible, God willing, he says basically, that if you find yourself enslaved as a captive, and George of Hungary, the one source he read, was a captive, and he knew about many of them. He says, God willing, if you are a captive, your job then is to be a faithful Christian in your servitude. And for him then, his small catechism became very important. He said, if you're going off to war, or if you live on the frontier between the Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, you should darn well memorize your catechism. Because if you find yourself a captive or enslaved, that you should repeat the catechism, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, and then you would demonstrate your faithful witness as a Christian. And perhaps, God willing, that might do its work. The word might do its work. So he certainly thought that was a possibility, but he said it would be difficult. But it was only in the reference to Christians being enslaved or as captives, prisoners of war, if you will, on the frontier.
So we have another minute. I'm going to ask a selfish question here. If we want to learn more, so you've already mentioned a number of important works, your own work, Professor Womack's work. I just want to give you a chance to say, what could people read if they want to learn more about Islam in this context, or about Luther's writings on the Turk?
Yeah, there's a couple of very good ones. So I'll give another plug to Deanna for her book. This is not just about Luther, but it's about good contemporary relationships. And then the one you mentioned, my book that just came out, More Than a Cup of Coffee and Tea. This is very helpful for Lutherans particularly, but it provides opportunity for others to think more about what it means to be in diverse relationships. But in terms of Islam and Luther, particularly, Gregory Miller, who teaches at Malone University in Dayton, Ohio, has a book called The Turks and Islam and Reformation Germany that came out in 2017. That's very helpful. A number of very readable chapters. Adam Francisco, who is at Concordia in Chicago, has probably the definitive work on Luther and his works called Martin Luther and Islam, a study in 16th century polemics and apologetics. It's very good. I disagree with him a little bit at the end, but his uncovering those sources are really key. It's very academic, though. It's very quite highly academic. And another really good, I think, contemporary work that helps us get at the issue of Islamophobia and the way that Christians, especially North American Christians, view Islam is by Todd Green at Luther College, called Presumed Guilty. This is really, really helpful about thinking through how do we as Christians think about Muslims, whoever they might be, right? And get beyond some of those stereotypes. Lastly, I guess I would say there's a book I have students read. It's a trade book. It's off the shelves by James Reston. It's a paperback called Defenders of the Faith: Christianity and Islam, Battle for the Soul of Europe, that came out in 2010, which is interesting because it's about this big and it reads very well. It's this engaging story of Europe during the 16th century. But what's interesting about it, the original title was Defenders of the Faith, Charles V, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the Battle for Europe. Well, obviously 2010, right during the Ground Zero Mosque controversy, they thought we could sell more books if we called it Battle for the Soul of Europe, so they redid the title, which is unfortunate, to sell books. But nevertheless, it's a good read and just kind of helps people get into the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire.
Well, I should say thank you. And all of those references that our guests may not have had time to write down, we will compile a bibliography and send it out to all of you. So no worries if you missed some of those great recommendations. We're out of time, so I want to thank you, Dr. Grafton, for your work and the conversation with us today. I want to thank all of our guests for being here. I'll put a plug in for our future conversations with our upcoming. We are going to, in 2 weeks, be with Dean Bell, who will talk to us about another important and controversial topic, Luther, Jews, and Judaism. That and all of our conversations can be found online at pitts.emory.edu/Kessler Conversations. Professor Grafton, thank you again. I've learned a lot. I know our guests have learned a lot on this really important topic. I want to wish you all a wonderful Wednesday afternoon. Stay safe, and thanks for joining us.